I'm David Runkle, the Deputy Director of the Institute of Politics, and on behalf of the Director of the Institute and the John F. Kennedy School of Government, I'd like to welcome you all here this evening for the latest in our series of programs on the Middle East. Earlier in this academic year, we've had speeches by Israeli Foreign Minister Shimon Peres, Jerusalem Mayor Teddy Kollek. We had a debate between Senator Abarisk and Hyman Bookbinder. We had a study group in the spring session on the Middle East. And tonight we're pleased to have this discussion on the Palestinian issue. To introduce a panel, I'd like to call on Kamal Ahmad to introduce our panel and to lead our discussion.
Whatever you choose. Thank you, David. Tonight is the beginning of a two-day symposium on peace in the Middle East, addressing the issue of Palestine. On behalf of Amnesty International at Harvard and Radcliffe Colleges, I'd like to welcome you all. The idea of this conference actually sprang rather spontaneously. Day after day, as we read newspaper reports of brutalities and violence in West Bank and Gaza, we wondered about what we as students in this community could do. How do we respond? What is it that we can do? The images on TV had a very personal touch for me. Growing up in the midst of a civil war in Bangladesh, a lot of the images that came on TV had a gruesome resemblance. But the question that we came back to over and over again is what we as students in this community so far away from where all of this is happening can do. And as we turned around, we realized that one thing we can do is try to educate ourselves and the rest of this community on the dimensions and the complexities of the problems that are confronted. Tonight, we are very fortunate to have an excellent set of panelists. But before I go ahead and introduce them, I'd like to take a minute to acknowledge the support we have received from various parts of the university to make this conference possible. The Dean of the College, Fred Jewett, the Dean of Freshmen, Henry Moses, Office of the Government and Community Affairs, as well as the Harvard Foundation, have all contributed to make this evening possible. We are very grateful to them. I think in order not to interrupt the flow of tonight's discussion, I will go ahead and introduce briefly all of our speakers and then call on them individually to speak for about 12 to 15 minutes. One of the things that's very frustrating with the media is, of course, it's a monologue. You can't really talk back to the TV or to the newspapers. And one of the things that we have hoped to achieve tonight is a real dialogue. People who are here to speak in front of you are very knowledgeable, probably one of the best in their fields, and it is up to you to engage them so that we can come away from this conference knowing a little more than what we do now. It's my pleasure, it's my honor to introduce our first speaker, Professor Nasir Aruri. I am to be blamed for the wrong spelling. It's spelled S-N-A-S-E-E-R, not as it shows on the table. Professor Aruri was born in Jerusalem, lived in the U.S. since 1954. He was educated at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. He's the author of numerous works on the Middle East and related areas. He's the author of Jordan, A Study in the Political Development, Enemy of the Sun, Poems of Palestinian Resistance, and a number of others. He's a founding member of the Association of Arab American University Graduates and a member of the Board of Directors of Amnesty International. Professor Aruri will be presenting his remarks on the Palestinian perspective of the crisis in the Middle East, with specific reference to the uprising in West Bank and Gaza. Professor Aruri will be followed by, if I can find my notes, by Professor Ian Lustig, who is an associate professor of government at Dartmouth College. Professor Lustig has been educated at the University of California at Berkeley. He is author, again, of numerous works, a lot of them focusing on the right-wing groups in Israel. He's recently returned from an extensive trip to the West Bank and Gaza, and we are very pleased to have him here. Professor Lustig will be followed by Professor Irene Genzier. She holds a joint appointment as professor in the Departments of History and Political Science and is also an associate of the African Studies Center at Boston University. She's also a research associate at the Middle Eastern Studies Center at Harvard University. Professor Genzier is author, again, of a number of books. Franz Fanon, A Critical Study, is one of our more noted works. She is currently at work on an analysis of post-World War II U.S. policy in the Middle East, with a special concentration on Lebanon in the 1958 period. And finally, Professor Genzier will be followed by Joe Gerson. Joe is Senior Program Secretary at the American Friends Service Committee, which, as some of you probably know, has been very active in the field of grassroots organizing in this area on the question of the Middle East. Joe has a long history of grassroots organizing, starting way back in the 60s in Georgetown University, where he was a student, and going on to the coal miners in West Virginia and so on. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our guests. First, Professor Nasir Aruri.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ahmed. My topic is the uprising, which began last December 9th, 1987. I'm going to, well, I should really say before I begin that although I was introduced as a member of the board of directors of Amnesty, I am not speaking tonight on behalf of Amnesty International. The uprising, which began on December 9th, 1987, is the topic of my presentation. The uprising seemed to have taken many people by surprise. Initially, Israeli analysts dismissed it as a passing cloud. Some speculated about the historical occasion which had provided the impetus, the closest being the 40th anniversary of the UN Partition Resolution, 29 November 1947, while some others attributed the uprising to despair. 20 years of occupation, we were told, have created that despair. The truth of the matter is that neither diagnosis was correct. There is no despair here because I think that this really is a flawed psychological analysis of a social reality. Desperation usually leads to random violence, but not to the kind of active struggle taking place in the occupied territories for the past 4.5 months. Despair does not lead to organized civil disobedience. It does not lead to self-reliance and grassroots work, as is the case now in the occupied territories. This sustained resistance has shown the futility of attributing a mass uprising to a specific incident or a single catalyst. This uprising is neither commemorative nor reactive, nor is it a new departure for the Palestinian people. It is but the latest phase of the Palestinian reawakening, which was stimulated by the 1967 Arab defeat. It is also an integral part of the Palestinian nationalist struggle, which spans most of the current century, in fact, since the early 1920s. This uprising of 1987-88 had been preceded by the first and second Arab Congresses, which were held in Haifa and Jerusalem in 1921 and 1922. It was preceded by the first Palestinian Women Congress, which was held in 1929, by the Hebron Congress of 1,000 peasants in 1929, and it was also preceded by the full-scale revolution of 1936 to 1939. The current uprising is the most recent of three major phases into which post-1967 history can be divided. The two preceding phases included the non-violent resistance of the early to mid-1970s, which was led by the Palestine National Front, and the broad movement of opposition to Camp David and the so-called civil administration of the late 1970s and early 1980s, which was led by mayors under the banner of the National Guidance Committee. So you have the Palestine National Front in the early 1970s, the National Guidance Committee in the late 70s, early 80s, and now you have the Intifada, or the Uprising of 87-88, that is post-1967 nationalist struggle. Altogether, the three phases since 1967 represent the Palestinian response to Israeli occupation, to the Israeli occupation of 1967, and its policies towards the Palestinians. Its policy to destroy Palestinian national consciousness, to destroy Palestinian culture, heritage, and history, and to deprive this people of its natural resources, land and water. No people in the world could possibly survive if they were robbed of these essentials which I mentioned: land, water, culture, and political identity. These four essentials. But the Palestinian people survived because they refused to acquiesce in the attempt, in Israel's attempt to destroy them as a people. They refused to become a helpless community. They refused to become an atomized, exploitable reservation, which Israel wants them to be. They have withstood the fourth strongest army in the world, the army against which they stand today with bare hands, with stones, with organization, with primitive tools, is larger than the one which had occupied their land 20 years ago. The uprising has already shown that there can be no return to the status quo ante. For what is in question is not really a specific policy of the occupation. They are not talking about Camp David or the civil administration as they used to in 1979. What is at issue today is the occupation itself. The occupation itself has become unacceptable. The mere fact of a prolonged occupation, which has all the attributes of permanency, has become rather untenable, utterly unacceptable. This occupation has at least three dimensions which made it so thoroughly unacceptable, and I will give them very, very quickly. At the legal level, it is an occupation which is declared by Israel as a non-occupation. When Shamir was asked not long ago about the impact of the occupation on Israeli society by David Grossman, an Israeli journalist, he said, "What occupation? I don't know of any occupation. Whom are we occupying?" At the legal level, this is considered as a non-occupation by Israel. At the political level, Israel does not recognize the Palestinians as a people entitled to self-determination. The homeland doctrine, which is subscribed to by both Labour and Likud, considers the Palestinians as inhabitants living on sufferance. Inhabitants living on sufferance. Hence, the famous Begin pronouncement after Camp David when he said, "We are going to give the Palestinians autonomy for the people, but not autonomy for the land." So the Palestinians are users of the land, but not owners, as far as the homeland doctrine is concerned. And then thirdly, at the economic level, the occupation has become what might be called a good deal for Israel. Tourism brings in $1.5 billion a year. More than 55% of the land in the West Bank and Gaza had been taken over by Israel. Israel's water consumption, water is more than half of Israel's water consumption, and the revenue is about $800 million. The taxes from the workers who work in Israel from the West Bank and Gaza are equivalent. They equal the entire budget of the occupied territories. What we are seeing today in the occupied territories is that you have a national collective will. It has declared this occupation unacceptable. And you have a unified and sustained endeavor aims to render it inoperable. Israel's decision makers will now have to contend with an ungovernable mass of Palestinians, realizing its demographic potential and utilizing its economic strength. They are neither desperados engaged in random violence, nor are they border infiltrators in search of hostages. They are organized components of a grassroots movement which aspires to maintain social order, which aspires to run the economy, to manage the educational system, to allocate scarce resources, to create a viable health infrastructure, to develop community-based solutions to social and economic needs. Their aim is to meet Palestinian needs by Palestinians. Their aim is not to outfight the Israelis. Their aim is to out-administer the occupant of their land. They are aiming towards creating that social reality that would make Palestinian independence necessary and not merely desirable. Having made the ultimate sacrifice, they challenged Israel in terms of raising the cost of the occupation in political terms, in economic terms, and also in moral terms. The uprising has accentuated Israel's crisis of governance. It has accentuated its crisis of leadership, as well as its moral crisis. Israel's resort to repression has already proven morally corrosive, as units of the army seem to convert themselves sometimes into a mob force, in effect holding a court on the street. Israel may have outlawed the capital punishment, but it has not really outlawed what Amnesty International may call extrajudicial execution, although Amnesty has not really used that term in this area. The uprising has communicated to Israel the message that if it becomes impossible for the Arabs to live here in dignity, it will be impossible for the Israelis as well. I don't have the time now, I suppose, to talk about the objectives of the uprising. Maybe we can do that in the question and answer period. But the command of the uprising through these leaflets that have been issued, of which I believe now there are 15, one can see that the program is really a program that is in consonance with the global consensus on the requisites of peace in the Middle East. That is to say, they are talking about mutual recognition, a Palestinian state existing alongside Israel, the right to self-determination to be enjoyed by the Palestinians, and the Israelis, of course, have already exercised that right, and they exercise it now. For the short-term goals, the uprising is asking the Israeli army to stop the brutality, to take the armed forces away from the cities, to try to let up on the policy of detention. As you probably know, more than 5,000 people are in jail today, and several detention camps have been opened since the uprising began in December of 1987. In effect, I think that the message that is being communicated to the Israelis and to the world is that this occupation is unacceptable, and that the only way out of this dilemma is for the Palestinians to enjoy equal rights, to have the same rights that the Israelis have been able to enjoy, and the same rights that everybody else in the world enjoys. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Professor Lustig, speaking on the Israeli response to the uprising.
Thank you, Kamal. As was explained, my presentation tonight is on the Israeli response to the Intifada, to the uprising. I spent 6 weeks in Israel and the West Bank. I came back a few weeks ago, and many of my remarks are based on extensive interviews and meetings that I had during that visit. The uprising has grabbed the attention of previously non-politicized Israelis, grabbed their attention in the way that people who don't have to think about politics, don't like to think about politics, prefer not to think about politics, and have a kind of slogan-esque understanding of their world. All of a sudden, they get hit on the head with an uprising, like a 2x4, and have to look up out of their private lives and ask political questions. Wait a minute, this isn't supposed to be happening. They're not a people. They know all the slogans, and all of a sudden the slogans aren't working. So they don't immediately adopt a new political attitude. For a brief moment, actually people are open to thinking about things. Now, many people in Israel who already had relatively firm opinions, those people in the middle, and there aren't that many, who are ready for a new way of looking at it, that's what the uprising has mainly done. It's gotten their attention. It's gotten their attention. But for most Israelis who have pretty firm opinions about it, it has polarized the previous opinions, moving people on the left, or when I say left, I mean dovish liberal left, further in that direction, and moving people on the hawkish right further in that direction. In a way, there are two camps inside of Israeli Jewish society. And one stretches from the Jews in Rakach, the Communist Party, all the way into the Labor, well into the Labor Party, and the other stretches from some of the people in the ultra-Orthodox parties or in the left wing of Likud, all the way over to Tzomet and Tria, the parties of Eitan and of Neiman, the right-wing party, extreme right-wing parties. The first camp are those who essentially favor a dialogue toward a political solution, even at the risk of the emergence from that dialogue, once entered into, of a Palestinian state. Those are the people who say, in the Kings of Israel Square in Tel Aviv, 2 nights before Shamir left for his meeting with Schultz, who had that meeting of 70,000 people under the slogan, "Say yes to peace. Say yes to peace." They face half the Israeli Jewish population on the right who have exactly the opposite perspective. Whatever you may think, and whatever I may think, of the sensibleness of the Schultz initiative, or how far it is from what is necessary to bring peace, it represented in its time the choice that Israelis can't agree on. As I said, one side is committed and is becoming increasingly committed since the uprising to entering some kind of open-ended dialogue, knowing, no matter what you say at the beginning, that you can't tell what will come out at the end. The other side, explicitly knowing that when you enter a political dialogue you don't know what can come out at the end, refuses to enter it. And that's the side represented by the present Prime Minister, Shamir. So when they met in the Kings of Israel Square, the next night, and I was at that demonstration too, with 170,000 much more frightened people, and much more enthusiastic also, their slogan was not say yes to peace, say no to the surrender talks, which is the way they were labeled. Because, as I said, from their point of view, even at the risk of successive wars and international isolation of Israel. Now, if you try to look for the impact of the uprising on Israeli Jews, you can't really find it in public opinion polls very usefully, at least not yet. It's going to take time for what has been happening to sink in and have its long-term effects. It may be hard here watching American TV to understand this, but for Israelis watching Israeli television, where all the cameras are shooting over the shoulders of the soldiers toward the Palestinian demonstrators, and the last shot in any TV sequence is an Israeli soldier with blood streaming down his face, smiling. And that is, even how tough it is, I'm still able to keep up my spirits. The whole way that the television approaches it is different. And, of course, the television also receives 500 calls a night that it is a degenerate viper in the heart of the state and is demoralizing the people and so on. What I'm trying to say is if you look at opinion polls about whether the Israeli army should be rougher or more gentle, over 70% will respond more harsh treatment, a stronger hand. And that is understandable. It doesn't really represent, in my view, anything of real political consequence. If you look at the polls of which parties are you going to vote for, how would you solve the Palestinian problem, how much territory are you prepared to give up, there's been very little change since the beginning. But that doesn't mean that there hasn't been a great deal of change inside of Israel. Those polls don't measure intensity. That's number one. So that, and there always have been, for the last 15 years, two relatively even, deeply divided camps in Israel on what to do about the territories and what to do about the Palestinians. Those camps still are intact, but the differences are becoming wider, deeper, and more intense. Also, there's another reason why you don't yet see this polarization, this ferment that is going on inside of Israel manifested in the polls and elsewhere in the positions of political parties. Just as the Yom Kippur War, the October War of 1973, which brought down the Golda Meir and Moshe Dayan and eventually brought down Labor, didn't show its consequences until after the following election. So too, this uprising won't show its political consequences until after the 1988 elections in November. Because until that time, Likud and Labor look at the political map and say 15,000 to 30,000 votes are going to determine the future of the state and who rules it. We're not going to take any chances. So they're both hugging the middle, trying to get the few Israeli votes that are still ready to be argument persuadable inside the middle. But if you look at what the coalition partners are doing, they are going to the extremes. So that Tchiyah, some extremists within Cherut, they are talking very openly, much more openly, about transferring the Arabs out of the land of Israel altogether, taking away the right to vote from Israeli Arabs one way or another. Whereas the left is much more ready to talk about an alliance with Israeli Arabs, to talk about talking with the PLO about the inevitability of a Palestinian state, about entering a dialogue with no limits set out when they defend the decision to enter the dialogue to other Israelis. Let me try to tell you a few incidents, a few stories that might give you a sense of how you can feel this polarization deeper in Israeli society. I spoke with a woman who's in the Central Committee of the Labor Party, which is the central group that decides on who runs for the Knesset and what order they are. She comes from an old family of patriotic Palmachniks, the striking force of the Haganah before 1948. She told me that she couldn't stand the idea that her son was a sergeant in Gaza, that she would much prefer him to be in Lebanon, where it's much more dangerous physically. But she can't stand the idea of him being changed from the inside. And she told me some stories about things that he had told her, which I don't have time to go into now, perhaps later I can. But one thing I can tell you is she said, he's in a real quandary, because if he comes home and he tells us that he beat the Arabs, I beat him. And if he comes home and he tells us that he didn't beat the Arabs, my husband beats him. So the polarization of the entire society is dividing families, breaking up dinner parties. It's present everywhere you go now in Israel. Inside also the settler community, inside the West Bank and Gaza. For example, I went to Ariel, one of the largest settlements in the West Bank, which is a yuppie settlement led by a yuppie mayor who prides himself on that fact. But this fellow, Ron Nachman, his name is a member of Gush Emunim, the extremist religious nationalist movement, though he himself is not religious, and despite all the orchids he grows for a hobby. Anyway, I've known him for a while. He's always prided himself in Ariel on the fantastic relations he has with the local Arab communities. They all work in our settlement. They clean our houses and so on. We have no problems with them. They have no problems with us. Coexistence, no problem. So I went there, and he showed me around the whole settlement, industrial development. The press is our enemy. They won't show how many people are interested in coming here. 1,000 people every Saturday come to look at the apartments. But not since the uprising. Nobody's coming. Well, that was interesting when he said that. He's showing me all the, as far as you can see on the hilltops, 30 different hilltops with white blobs on them. They're all settlements. And he's naming every single one of them. Some I can hardly see. There are 3 Arab villages right in front of us. I said, so what are the names of the Arab villages? So he tells me one, but he doesn't know the other ones. I said, what are you going to do about the Arabs? He says, first, we have to come to a point of decision inside the Jewish sect, among the Jews. A civil war to purify the blood of the people. What? I said it was in Hebrew. I want to make sure I got it. He says, to clean the blood of the people. Then there'll be a very big war with Syria. There won't be any Arabs here. I said, you didn't talk like that a few months ago, last year when you came to Tufts and told us how wonderful your relations with the local Arabs were. And I said, what changed? The uprising? He said, yes. My wife saw a Molotov cocktail hit the school bus. No one was hurt, but she saw the fighter on the bus, and that changes everything. Anyway, how many times can I hold my people back? Once, twice. There's going to be a pogrom, by which he meant we're going to go into one of those Arab villages and take care of it. A week and a half later, that happened. The army stopped the 22 cars of settlers on the outside of the village and tear gassed them in order to break up their attempt to go into the village. The first time the army has used tear gas against Jews. On the other hand, those are the believing settlers. But you get another reaction. There was an article in Ma'ariv one evening that took a lot of attention, called Fear, 5 Minutes from Kfar Saba. What this was an interview with people who would not give their names, who were living in these fancy settlements just over the Green Line, that they'd gotten profitable apartments. They're terrified. They don't know, should I go out of my house when the Arabs throw a Molotov cocktail and get killed by the Arabs? Should I stay in the house and have the house burned to death? I don't know what to do. And several other people saying the same thing. I was on a bus going through from settlement to settlement. I saw a woman reading this article. I waited till she was done. I said, excuse me, miss, isn't that a little exaggerated? Oh, no, she said, we don't like to talk about it, but that's how we're feeling. I asked her, well, what are you doing about it? Why aren't you leaving? He said, we don't have any money. We bought these apartments. We don't have much money. Now, if we could buy an apartment inside the Green Line, we'd do it. There are some people who are so scared that they've locked their apartments, gone live with their parents. So you can see, even among the settlers, there's a polarization that's set in that is very dramatic. You also hear, on the one hand, on the left or on the left of center, people who are starting to think again they'll ask you, so you're the expert, tell us what's necessary. You say, we're going to have a Palestinian state, and if you're lucky, it's going to be run by the PLO, and you better start talking to them. Now, when I would say that 4 years ago, they would start screaming at me. Now the modal response is, It's a sigh. It's a kind of a sigh of acceptance, which is a very interesting response. On the other hand, when you talk and hear the other side of it, when they talk about the left, they're ready to eliminate the leadership of Peace Now as Soviet agents, as people who would be happier anyway in New York and Paris, and so on. There was a meeting between the leaders of Gush Emunim and the leaders of Peace Now, which now is the most hawkish of all the peace groups in Israel. And the purpose of the meeting was to try to find some agreement of a red line that they would not cross in their struggle with one another. And the leader of Gush Emunim got up and started talking about the two societies, the society of Hashem, of God, and the society of Dizengoff, of Tel Aviv squares, the materialist, degenerates, liberals. For 15 minutes he was talking when one of the Peace Now leaders got up and said, wait a minute, we didn't come to hear this. Gush Emunim people were so shocked that they had dared to interrupt their leader that they almost left. But they stayed, and they tried to find an agreement. Gush Emunim said, look, our red line is that you should not demonstrate side by side with Arabs against us. Peace Now refused to accept that, and the leader of Peace Now, one of them said, my red line, the green line is my red line. When you go over the green line, you endanger my children. And on that note, the meeting broke up. They could not agree on anything that would limit their own struggle with one another. And I don't have any more time, really, so I just want to mention the 3 points I would conclude with, and perhaps we can get them into the discussion period if you ask the right questions. There are two political trends that are produced by the polarization. One is, and both have to do with factors that have been peripheral to Israeli politics and have all of a sudden, over the last few years, become central. One is Israeli Arabs, who never used to have any political power in Israel, and now everyone agrees that if there's going to be a Labour Party government, a government that actually could negotiate a peace agreement, it can only come about because of Arab political support and a large Arab turnout inside of Israel. And the right knows that, and is taking the steps which it deems necessary against the legitimacy of Arab political participation in Israel. The other now central factor is the army. Despite what we see on TV and the difficulty it may be to believe this, the army is commanded by people very much to the left of center in the high command. And the right knows this and has repeatedly been calling for them to be fired and replaced. For the first time, the army is not carrying out its mission in the sense of gaining victory. Not only that, is refusing to provide the government with options that it says could get victory. That is what we would call in the Middle East Hama rules, destroying whole towns, deporting large numbers of people, killing 50 Arabs a day, and so on. They're refusing to do that. They're defining the struggle as one that can only be solved politically, and the right can't tolerate this definition. The army is now part of the great national struggle over what to do with the West Bank and Gaza. Instead of being able to say, we are just representing the bare minimum consensus, we're staying out of politics. And this has enormous implications. Finally, it is understandable, but is no less unfortunate, that the exhilaration that Palestinians in the territories feel on all levels, and most of this energy in the uprising is coming from previously non-politicized people in the villages and the camps, they are not coming forward and saying, yes, I only want the West Bank and Gaza, don't worry about it, everything will be fine once you give me that. They are coming forward full of life, full of a sense of empowerment, and saying, Kull Palestine, all Palestine, Muslim and Arab. Now, when you show that on TV, it's 15,000 votes to the Likud. Now, this kind of difficulty of correlating, just as Israelis are starting to learn a bit, the Palestinians not mobilizing latent, larger demands that are pure and legitimate from their point of view, is the same problem that the Israelis had after 1967. Just getting Arab readiness to accept Israel inside the Green Line and having all these demands which are pure and legitimate from inside the Zionist perspective come forward, demands for Jewish rule over the whole land of Israel. Thank you.
My two previous colleagues have described where the action is taking place. It remains for me to describe where inaction dominates. Of course, I think it's true that the last 5 months have changed life in the United States, much less than in the West Bank and Gaza, and much less than in Israel. But I believe that those of us here who have always been concerned with this issue feel that there is a qualitative change in the discussion of the Palestinian question. In fact, probably 5 months of activity such as we have seen has changed the issue in the following way. For the first time, the Palestinian question is on the national and the international agenda. It is no longer an issue that we can afford to forget or ignore. But while many Israelis concede that the developments that Ayan has described have forever changed their lives, and while Palestinians react, as Nasir has explained to us, to affirm a commitment to self-determination and not to express despair, in the United States there are very many different sources of activity and response. For sure, it seems to me that the print media and the television media have broken a barrier for the first time, and it is very significant. We see developments in the West Bank and Gaza as news. That is to say, the coverage of this story is very much the coverage of a news story. We are beginning to get some kind of an education, perhaps like that about Central America or South Africa, that we had not obtained before. And I think that all of us who follow this register that shock. Indeed, we are so amazed to see something like news, normal news coverage, that we regard that as an event. We hear very frequently that within the Jewish community in the United States, the change is also perceptible. Within the organized and the unorganized Jewish community, the level of concern is extremely high. And while the organized Jewish community continues to express total solidarity for Israel, there is absolutely no doubt, if one judges simply by advertisements that appear in the press, that a substantial number of people do not follow that line at all. The public mood in general seems to have changed. If one follows the polls that have appeared, there is a very definite shift. The shift is that on the public level, people now are ready for a political solution. They are sympathetic to the idea of a political solution. They understand the fact that it is possible to consider this as a political struggle which will not be satisfied by a military resolution of the conflict. And yet, it seems to me that if one considers the impact that the struggle has had and is having, we need to confront the fact that we in the United States, and I'm leaving out official Washington for a moment, that we remain surprised. Even now, the level of discussion is pitifully low. I'm not talking about Ted Koppel as an example of discussion in the United States at large. We've become used to a stifled discussion. We've become used to a chronic unpreparedness. We face every crisis as though it has absolutely no antecedents. We have no sense that this place, this region, not only Israel, but the Middle East, that it has a history. We have no sense that it has a politics. We have no sense that there are struggles in this area that need to be understood on their own terms and that don't easily fall into a Cold War pattern. We treat the area as though it's made of blocks. Israel is a block. We ask of presidential candidates only one question: where do they stand on Israel? We don't ask them what Israel, we just say yes or no. We talk about Arab states as though they constitute a block. The only perceptible definition that we accept is a distinction between the moderates and those who are not so moderate. Of course, moderate refers only to the relations of these states towards the United States. It isn't very revealing as far as their internal politics are concerned. Apparently, the risks of looking at the Middle East in political terms are great. How else to explain the fact that we have managed to avoid this for so long? If you consider Israel alone, in 1988, Israel was slated to receive $3 billion in direct U.S. government gifts, not loans. Of this, $1.8 billion was to be forgiven foreign military sales credits, and $1.2 billion was to be grant economic support fund money. This represents no less than 46.5% of total foreign military sales program and 38% of the funds budgeted for the economic support program. And overall, aid to Israel represents no less than 42.5% of worldwide budget of these two key programs. Surely the fact that such sums are allocated at the same time they are allocated in countries where the population of a democratic and highly politicized society such as this claims to be asks no questions. So I suggest that while on the public level the events in the West Bank have sent shockwaves through the world, including the United States, on a public level still we remain very far behind. Our discussion of the Middle East remains very dangerously underdeveloped. What we lose in the process is not only a sense of what is going on within the Middle East, we lose entirely the significance of U.S. policy in the Middle East. Consider the fact that of the presidential candidates whom we have heard in the last few months, none has raised the overall question of U.S. policy in the Middle East, excluding, of course, affirming the need to reflag and affirming commitment to Israel. And this, of course, is not new, and what the presidential campaign reflects is simply a commitment by both parties to avoid these issues as much as possible. And it is an avoidance which would be, I believe you'll agree with me, utterly impossible on the question of Central America, even less possible on the question of South Africa. But on the Middle East, the public at large goes along very, very smoothly with the decision not to interfere. Even at periods of crisis, for example, when over 240 American Marines were blown up in Lebanon, no questions asked. The administration had declared Lebanon an area absolutely indispensable to American security, no questions asked. Short while after, it declared Lebanon an area to which no Americans are allowed to go. It's so dangerous, no longer indispensable to American security, no questions asked. Why? The Palestinian question has never been high on the agenda of U.S. policymakers in the Middle East, and I believe it is not high on the agenda of policymakers in the Middle East at the present time. The Washington response to events in the West Bank, of course, the Schultz Plan. But before considering the Schultz Plan, let's put it into some kind of perspective. In the first place, of course, there is the habit of colonial countries and the successors of colonial countries to regard their third world clients as something less than equal. Although Dulles said in the 50s that this was no longer the age of colonialism, and that the major European powers and the United States would have to devise a new way to speak to their clients in the third world, such a language has still not been developed. The National Security Council documents from the period of World War II to the present, and official and semi-official analyses of U.S. policy at the present time make clear that the dominant interests of the United States in the Middle East are quite simple to identify. They are first oil, perhaps second oil and third oil, but let's say they are first oil, the containment of the Soviet Union and Soviet influence, the protection of Israel, and I would add, though this language does not appear, the containment of the natives. The natives represent a very dangerous element in the Middle East, as in the Far East and Central America and Southern Africa. They have the capacity to rebel. They have the capacity to make demands that may not fit. And this capacity cannot be classified simply as the capacity of those who are radicals or those who are nationalists. In the Middle East, therefore, I would say that the primary interest of the U.S. has always been oil, and secondly, it has been to assure the maintenance of regimes in power that can guarantee what we like to call stability without defining it. Stability in our interests, and stability, of course, in the interests of the regimes that are in power. Until 1967, the question of Palestine appeared with great regularity in National Security Council reports. They still do. Many are declassified, and those I've seen are shot full of holes. But my feeling is that in the period 67 to 73, and notably after 73, there was a sea change here too. With the developments in the 67 war, and particularly after the 73 war, there was a major shift in orientation, political orientation within the region. With the move of Egypt towards the United States and the reorientation of the region such that the major clients of the United States, including Saudi Arabia and Egypt and Jordan and Israel, dominated the area, local conflicts, what we call now low-intensity conflicts, were viewed as highly manageable. In 1979, with the fall of the Shah, there was again an enormous thunderstorm, and once again, many of the questions that people are asking now, how could it happen? How come we didn't know? Why were we so unprepared? Why didn't we ever talk to the opposition? Why didn't we listen to those intelligence reports that explain what was going on? That 1979 shock has been, in a sense, partially absorbed, followed very, very quickly by the Camp David Accords and the Camp David Treaty that once again implied a new orientation, a new management of political forces in the region. A very successful management from the point of view of the United States and Israel witnessed the 1982 Lebanon War, in which no Arab state intervened, which was very, very well contained from the point of view of these two states. Less so from the point of view of the populations, less so from the point of view of European states who have a sense, perhaps some more distance, some more dispassion, but who can calculate the human as well as the political toll that that has taken. There has been no sense in Washington that the Palestine question really is an urgent question that in any way undermines U.S. interests in the region. And unless it undermines the interests of U.S. allies or the United States, I, for one, very much doubt that much attention and much effort will go into an attempt to implement a plan, let alone create a workable plan. And there have been many such plans. The history of the last 20 years is absolutely littered with plans that almost succeeded. We have, I would say, in addition to the habit of depoliticizing the Middle East, we have another habit, and that is of promoting a kind of historical amnesia with respect to these crises and this particular question. If we actually sat down and considered the plans that were presented and that were susceptible to working, we are always left with a question, why did the U.S. not push it further, let alone the other parties? Well, let's consider the Schultz Plan. The Schultz Plan is suddenly presented in the aftermath of the developments in the West Bank. It represents a synthesis of 242, UN Resolution 242, and aspects of the Camp David. It calls for an international conference. It's an interesting, significant shift to be followed. As a matter of fact, it was to be followed tomorrow by negotiations for an interim phase of Palestinian self-administration. That's the old autonomy language of the Camp David in the occupied territories. And it was to conclude with talks on a final status of lands in December to be determined by various delegations. Immediately on beginning his travels, the Secretary of State recognized that no Arab government was wildly enthusiastic about the Schultz Plan, and recognized very quickly that the Israeli government, and notably the government of Shamir, was very unenthusiastic about this plan. And if we follow the press very carefully, we see that explanations for the discontent is very easy to understand. On the Israeli side, Shamir considered it entirely unacceptable. After all, it involved some kinds of concessions, and we've just heard there's absolutely no room for concessions in the worldview that the Likud represents. And indeed, although Foreign Minister Peres at the present time supported the idea of an international conference on substantive issues, he did not part with his government. In the Arab states, the dissatisfaction with the Schultz Plan was precisely the same, after all, that existed with the UN Resolution 242, even though that had been accepted by the Arab states that count in this story. And I'm referring simply to the fact that the Palestinians still appear only as refugees, and there is no recognition of the Palestinian question other than as a refugee question. But yet, to telescope this discussion very fast, and I hope that we can come back to it, we need to face the fact that in the course of these few months, in spite of all efforts, in spite of all symbols that suggest a commitment to a political resolution of this question, the Reagan administration, in the person of Schultz, simply acceded to Shamir's rejection, met that on April 22nd with the formalization of the U.S.-Israeli agreement, which formalized cooperation on a wide range of military, economic, political, and intelligence matters. Perhaps the answer is that, in fact, in Washington, as in Tel Aviv, for slightly different reasons, but in Washington, it's possible to overlook the fact that the world has changed, that the PLO itself, in the person of its leader, has come out with a consistent series of statements on UN Resolution 242, on the meaning of an international conference, on his long-range views. There's been absolutely no response from Washington on these issues. No need is felt to respond to these matters. We need to confront why that is the case. I submit to you that I think it's the case simply because the Palestinian question in itself represents very little interest for the United States. Its interest in the past was largely the fact that it was a terribly divisive issue, that it was a radicalizing movement whose consequences were very feared. That is less the case now, and to the extent that the Palestinian issue will be managed in the Middle East, first of all in Israel, secondly in Jordan, and to a lesser extent in other Arab states, it will not preoccupy Washington. Indeed, I think one has to conclude that the substance of the agreements, for example, of the substance of the April 22 agreement, is far more important. The global collaboration of Israel and the United States represents something much more important, not to be tampered with by an issue that is so vital to Israel, but so much less vital to the United States. The question, for example, of nuclear policies, another issue not discussed in the U.S., but that ought to be discussed in the U.S., is perhaps much more important with respect to the importance that Israel has for the U.S. at the present time, irrespective of the Palestinian issue. So my final words of conclusion are simply the following. In a sense, there is a new tension in the U.S., a potentially important tension. The tension is between a public that now wants to know, that demands to know why this problem has been so long in the making, and why so little effort has gone into its resolution. A public that is now much less willing to accept cliched answers, and that hopefully will be much less prepared to accept cliched answers from its own government about the extent of involvement that the United States has and the very limited success that it can show in the resolution of this crisis. Thank you.
Good evening. I've been sitting here and thinking increasingly that my outline is absolutely irrelevant. Thinking that in some ways I know I have something in common with one member of the audience here. I'm feeling a little bit like Sesame Street. Those of you who may have seen it, they often have a song that goes, which of these things is not the same, which of these things is different? And, you know, 3 kids playing baseball and 1 shooting baskets. My task, as opposed to providing analysis of state and elite policies, is to talk more about how people engage at the grassroots level, how we here and in the places that we live can have some impact on the life and death and issues of life and death of real people on the other side of the world. So we're going to get apples and oranges, and I hope you'll be patient with me. I think one of the things that's been most frustrating, and the other piece I wanted to say was just in terms of my credentials. I've been working at this at the grassroots level for about 15 years or so with obvious success, and wondering what that meant in terms of the appropriateness of my being here before you. I did want to start, though, by reaffirming some of the things in particular that Irene Genzier has been talking about in terms of a frame of reference, particularly for those among us here who are U.S. citizens and who call this place our home. George Kennan is best known, I think, for the containment doctrine that he authored, less well known for Policy Planning Memorandum number 23, written in 1948, when he was head of planning at the State Department. And I'd like to quote from that for a moment if I can. He said, "We have about 50% of the world's wealth, but only 6.3% of its population. This disparity is particularly great as between ourselves and the people of Asia. In this situation, we cannot fail but to be the object of envy and resentment. Our real task in the coming period is to devise a pattern of relationships which will permit us to maintain this position of disparity without positive detriment to our national security." And he goes on to write, "We should dispense with the aspiration to be liked or to be regarded as the repository of a high-minded international altruism. We should cease to talk about vague and unreal objectives such as human rights, the raising of living standards, and democratization." Now, I would argue that this, in fact, has been the basic frame of reference for American foreign policy in the Middle East, just as it has been in relationship to Africa, Central and Latin America, and Asia. And that in this context, the United States has had the Nixon Doctrine, and it has led such people as General Mataheu Peled, now a member of the Israeli Knesset, to reflect on some of the similarities with longer-term Jewish history in Europe, in an op-ed piece he wrote called "With Enough Rope," watching, for example, how the United States, when it was in U.S. interest to sell, for example, the army of South Vietnam down the river, when it was no longer in U.S. interest, or to view, for example, the Shamir-Schultz Memorandum of Understanding in the midst of ostensible negotiations for regional peace. So I think we need to look at U.S. policy with a rather sharper eye, and then, of course, to ask the next question. As citizens of a relatively democratic society,